From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City.
Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
There's a terrible disconnect with the inauguration of the 47th President of the United States taking place on Martin Luther King Day. Two men with unimaginably different visions for our nation and its inhabitants. We've talked a lot in recent weeks about Christian nationalism and its likely impact on the incoming administration. This week, I want to take time to share with you my thoughts about getting through this moment together, and also to get the thoughts of Jeanné Lewis, CEO at Faith in Public Life. We need these conversations to happen now more than ever. If this show is something you care about, please make sure you subscribe, share, and rate the State of Belief podcast at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Our library of past conversations includes well over 100 hopeful, empowering, and inspiring interviews with guests like Father Jim Martin, journalist Catherine Stewart, Rabbi Sandra Lawson, Imam Abdullah Antepli, Jim Wallace, and many, many others. You can help grow the State of Belief with a financial contribution. Find out how at stateofbelief.com, and you can support and join the work of Interfaith Alliance at interfaithalliance.org. Again, welcome to the State of Belief. This week, I wanted to do a special episode because I'm feeling so strongly about this moment in our nation's history, and I wanted to speak directly to you, my listeners, and really talk through, some of what is happening, how I'm feeling, imagining how you might be feeling, and really think about, where we are and what we can do given all that is coming at us right now. I don't need to tell you, but there is so much coming at us right now. And it's affecting us. And it's affecting our sense of who we are individually and as a nation. It's affecting the sense of what we can do, what is our agency. It's affecting the sense of who we are, who we belong to, who is in our future with us. What does the future look like? For those of us who have children in our lives, the question of what kind of country will we be handing to them? All of these things are really weighing down on us. And, I'll speak personally. I woke up today and I was just feeling like, oh my God. And, I'm embarrassed to say that, one of the things I go to is, I go on to the internet, I go on to social media, I go on to the news, and I see what's the latest. And, I don't know that that's the healthiest thing to do. It feels like part of my role, but I do know that my heart always breaks a little bit more. And in this time, it's really broken open. And so I'm hoping that my broken open heart might be something that each of you will experience empathy today, at least, that I'm feeling you, I'm feeling this moment. And also, hopefully together we can find a way forward. We get a lot of questions like, what can we do? What can I do? I think we're all asking that question. What can I do? I'm very fortunate as my role of president of Interfaith Alliance that I get to have something every day that I can do that I feel is really important. We're promoting Promise 2025. We're working on issues that feel very important to religion and democracy. So I'm very lucky, but I think a lot of people are out there, well, what can I do? What can I do? And I do want to encourage people. There is something you can do. None of us are powerless. if the history of any movement that was for peace or for social justice or for equality, any of that, that was done because individuals decided to show up and be present and be counted and do something. And so, I think the first thing to do, and I'm going to start with this because I think it's very important. Take care of yourself. Like, let's start with that. Let's start with the recognition that maybe the first thing you do in the morning is not look at the news, but maybe it's like, do some meditation, take some time in prayer, or go to go to a spin class, or do some gentle chair yoga, or whatever gives you life in this moment. Don't skimp on that. Okay? We're about to go into it. It is not going to be a sprint, it's a marathon. And there is no way that we're going to make it if we're in a constant stage of, rage. Like, each of us has to make sure that we are centered and that we're living our life and that we find joy. Make sure to protect your joy, protect your happiness. It doesn't have to be a big, huge thing. It can be a beautiful moment with yourself, a beautiful moment with a loved one. Call someone who you really like. I'm just giving a few examples. You'll find it for yourself. I talked to Catherine Stewart, and I don't think I'm talking out of school here, but she works all the time on Christian nationalism and all the time. And she just was like, you know what? Last time around, I let them steal so much of my life, and I'm not going to do it this time. I'm going to make sure that I have an opportunity to live my life joyfully, do the work, but also live my life joyfully. So that's the first thing. Take care of yourself. As far as what we can do, I want to mention some very solid things that I think each of us can do in the coming weeks to make sure that we feel like we're showing up with the most power possible. The first thing I want you to consider is, how are you going to get your news? What's a news source that you trust? Right now, there are a lot of mainstream news sources that are doing amazing work, but there is a lot of pressure on these places, and a lot of them, frankly, have bent the knee a little bit more than I would have liked. You can still, do your Washington Post, do your New York Times if you want, but there's a lot of other great news sources, often independent news sources, local news sources, both nonprofit and profit, but just know your news source. Go to places where you'll get information that feels correct, grounded in reality, grounded in truth, because there's so much unreality, so much untruth out there. Find a place to get some truth so that you feel like you're on solid ground as you move forward. Maybe, hopefully, you will view it as one place, as the state of belief. I hope you'll tune in and invite others too. But there's lots of other really good sources, whether that's social media feeds that you feel like are really smart, local media that is proved trusted, and that you come to respect the journalists, the storytellers. So make sure you do that. The next thing is, find one, maybe two issues that you really feel like, I have energy to show up for that. I think part of it is that there's so much coming at us right now. It's like a tidal wave. Don't think about it that way. Maybe you're passionate about books. Maybe you're passionate that book banning is happening and it goes against your basic sense of decency. Show up in that way. Figure out what's happening in your local community around that issue. And, show up to the school board. Show up to the city council. Show up to the mayor's office or whoever is in control and say, I really care about this, because right now, how we show up, where we place our bodies is really important. And so, how will you show up, and where will you show up, and for what will you show up, and for whom will you show up? Those are super duper important questions. They're in your community. There will be people who will be targeted in these next months. Will you, can you say, okay, you know what? I will make sure that I am in communication with my local religious communities that are different from my own. And And if they get attacked, if they get, people are trying to marginalize them, I will show up with them. If there are racial minorities or immigrant status minorities, will you show up with them? And I'm not saying do all of this. I'm saying pick one or two that you really are paying attention to, and trust that your neighbors are also paying attention to things that they really care about. There are figuring out ways to make sure that you're aware of what movements, what laws are trying to be passed in your local community, but also what is your representative involved with? One of the things that we're really trying to do at Interfaith Alliance is keep track on the bills that are going through right now that specifically are targeting religious minorities, that are specifically targeting trans people and LGBTQ people, that are specifically targeting immigrants, others. And we're going to be sending out alerts, helping you to show up and reach out to your local officials. And so these are opportunities. It seems like it's small, and we all want to do that big thing that will turn the tide. That never is how it happens. It's a series of small people putting in their bag of sand, putting up their stake in the ground and saying, no, past me you don't go. And each of us has an opportunity and responsibility. Right now, there is a story that is essentially a lie, that the Trump-Vance administration has a huge mandate to do anything. They don't have a mandate. Let's remember that something like 50% of the Americans actually showed up to this election. And out of those 50, so maybe they had 25, 30% of the Americans behind them. They had almost exactly an equal amount of Americans who voted for Vice President Harris. And so there is no mandate. It's just a question of how we show up, if we show up, when we show up, with whom we show up. So there are things you can do, but do something that is sustainable, that you feel passionate about, that you believe in, and tell your friends, invite them to join you. So this is an opportunity. Every day, in every way, there is a small thing that we can do that adds up to a mighty thing that we can do. The other thing I really want to talk to you about today is the moment that we're in, and the rather extraordinary moment of having the inauguration of Donald Trump on the same day that we celebrate the birth of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, this is one of those, two paths in the forest diverge. Which path are you going to take? And there could not be a stronger sense of different ways of showing up in the world, and how you use your life, your one precious life. Dr. King really invites us, especially those who are religious, especially those of us who follow the Christian faith. He really invites us into a certain way of being and a certain approach to how to show up. And, we all know that religion as a kind of institution, as a way of, approaching the world, religion can be used for good, or it can be used for bad. There's always a way that religion, if we think about Dr. King, religion was used for liberation, was used for celebration, was used as a bridge to other people. It was used as an opportunity to create a more perfect union, to live into the promise of this country of civil rights for all, not just for some. But we also know that religion can also be about subjugation. It can be about creating power for people like you and using the religion to justify that power. It can be used to discriminate My religion says I shouldn't like you. My religion says you're inferior. My religion says that you are a sin, or your life is a sin. And so I'm going to use that as an excuse for discriminating against you. And I'm actually going to institute laws that reinforce that. I'm going to use my power to use the law to reinforce that. And so, this country from the beginning has had both strains of religion at the very beginning. And we have had some who want to use religion as justification for slavery, justification for second-class citizenry for women, justification of rounding up and killing Native Americans and indigenous people. These are all things that were justified explicitly by religion. And here we have an incoming administration that has used that power of religion, of what we call now Christian nationalism, to say there are some people in this country who deserve more respect, who deserve more rights, who deserve more privilege than others. That's what Christian nationalism insists, and many of those people were involved in the election of Donald Trump, and he is already planning to deliver it to them. We have this in existence already in states like Florida, which is trying to erase the history of slavery in the school books, which has prohibited saying gay or mentioning other kinds of families in their in schools, which has taken away reproductive freedom in Texas and in places like that, and persecuted and resulted in the death of women. This is already in existence. This strand of Christianity, especially Christianity, which has been part of the American experience. And we have to acknowledge that. In some ways, we have reached a new pinnacle of power for that history in the inauguration of Donald J. Trump for another term. And yet here he is. And also, as I said before, he would have been convicted of trying to overturn the 2020 election, because that's what he did. He sent a mob, and now he's thinking of pardoning them. That mob, inspired by Christian nationalism, insisting that their God said that Donald Trump was going to be president, and God damn it, if he's not president, we're going to attack the Capitol. And we're going to target his vice president, who's a very pious man who I disagree on many things, but he did the right thing that day. Mike Pence. Let's hang Mike Pence. Donald Trump set people on that. People forget that. Okay, so this guy is about to get back in power with all of the Christian white privilege. So that's happening. That's happening. But at the same time, we are going to celebrate. I am going to celebrate the great American, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose father was also a pastor, who came out of a great Black Christian tradition, which has always been the great prophetic religious tradition in this country, which, while the masters had their Christianity, there was slave religion, in such an important area of study. And how they understood the stories of liberation in the Bible to be also for them in this time. And we're gonna lift up Dr. King, and we're gonna think about what Dr. King means to us today. Who Dr. King is in 2025 America. When he looks at the steeples in the letter from the Birmingham jail and says, "On sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. Over and over, I have found myself asking what kind of people worship here. Who is their God?" So we can ask that of the Christian nationalists and the Donald J. Trumps of the world. Even more important, let's turn to King. For those of us who are Christian, it's very important for our own state of our soul. For those of you listening, and I know there are many of you who either are not religious or come from the Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, many other faith traditions, what is it about King and the way he understood our world and the call in this time to our world? Let's think about a few ideas, what he offers us today. One is, what is your religion trying to do? Who is it for? Who is it standing with? The other thing about Dr. King that I want to lift up today, 2025, the weekend where we have the inauguration of a president who is like the antithesis of Dr. King. Dr. King was actually one of the great interfaith voices in our country. We have to remember that Dr. King was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, who was of the Hindu tradition and whose teachings on the power of nonviolence influenced Dr. King. Dr. King looked beyond his own faith tradition and saw beauty and wisdom and value in other people's tradition. He also invited Heschel, who was this great scholar of Jewish thought, to walk with him. And Heschel held a Torah as they walked in protest of the rights that kept Black Americans down. And they walked together, and also Catholic and many other traditions. Thich Nhat Hanh. There was a sense of the whole being more beautiful because we knew one another and we called upon one another. I have a funny, not funny story about just this moment in the first term of Trump when he went to the Vatican. And it's very related to what we're talking about now. He brought the complete works of Dr. King to give to the Pope. And I was on MSNBC talking about this, and I was just like, those books must have burned him, because, burned his fingers. Because if there was ever someone who did not represent the tradition of King in any way, and yet here he was, passing them along to the Pope. And, Pope Francis, I'm sure actually has read King and appreciated him. So, up next, thoughts for Martin Luther King holiday from Jeanné Lewis, who serves as CEO at Faith in Public Life. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And be sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. As we anticipate the observance of Martin Luther King Day on January 20th of 2025, I wanted to get the insights of Jeanné Lewis, CEO at Faith in Public Life. The organization has long taken the lead in fighting racial and economic injustice in America, and doing it in the name of faith-driven values. Jeanné is a faith organizer, an authority on creating empowered communities, who has dedicated her career to building bridges and closing equity gaps, which is exactly who we need to hear from as the observance of Martin Luther King Day coincides with the inauguration of Donald J. Trump. So, Jeanné Lewis, welcome to The State of Belief.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, I'm just so excited to speak with you. We had the honor of participating in a vigil together around January 6th, and I had just the pleasure and so inspiring to hear you talk about your own background, your own faith tradition in a very personal way as you approached this very serious day of January 6th and all that we were thinking about and remembering on that day. I was wondering if we could start out there, a little bit about your own background around your own faith tradition and how you made it yours.
Yeah. So I grew up Roman Catholic. I'm a cradle Catholic, born in the Washington, D.C. area. And my mother's side of the family is also Catholic. But I was exposed to different denominations of Christianity very early in my life. My grandmother left the Catholic Church and founded a Protestant non-denominational church shortly before I was born. So in the summers when I visited her, I was a member of her church community and I went to Catholic Mass. And I went to a Baptist Christian elementary school from kindergarten to 6th grade. So I was exposed to Baptist Christian practices and traditions very early as well. And I think those formative experiences are a big part of what informs how I live my faith today. Because as a child, I could see that people identified with different denominations or different labels of their faith, but there were so many commonalities and so many through lines. And I've had a lot of other experiences with other communities throughout my life, with Jewish communities and Muslim communities, Hindu communities. But I see that theme coming back over and over, regardless of the name of our religion, regardless of the denomination or the particular terms we use. There are so many shared values and so many shared practices all pointing us to the divine. And I try to bring that lens to the work we do here at Faith in Public Life.
Yeah, I'm eager to hear more about Faith in Public Life and how you all are, as an organization, approaching this time we're entering into. But one of the things I really am trying to put forward as a value that many of us are talking about and have been for a long time is self-care. And I think one of the things that you talked about in your talk on January 6th, but also just I know you value, is like making sure we're caring about ourselves. Like there is a lot that's coming at us already and more to come. And earlier in the program, I was really talking about, to our listeners about taking care of ourselves because the onslaught is almost a strategy. And I just would love to hear from your faith tradition or any other sources of care. What are you looking towards to make sure that Jeanné Lewis is able to not only survive but thrive in this difficult time?
You're absolutely right, Paul. The onslaught and the pacing of change and chaos is in itself a tactic. For me, I am really drawn to Christian mystic practices. So, as a Roman Catholic, I think my first introduction to a Christian mystic practice is the Rosary. My grandmother said the Rosary every single day. But anything that allows us to practice silence and really listen to God in that silence through our prayer, for me, is very, very healing. And it helps not only to spiritually ground me, but even physically and mentally ground me. Turning off the screens, turning off, the podcast, the radio, and really sitting still, even if it's just for a few minutes a day, is really critical. I also think it's important in this time for us to be gracious with ourselves, also to be gentle with ourselves. I know that so many of us want to make the world a better place. We work day and night to make the world a better place. But the work that we do is larger than any one of us individually. And I think I am constantly trying to get better at getting myself grace about what I'm able to do in a given day and a given hour. And really understanding the impact of what I do is being connected to people who came before me and people who came after me. And that's a little bit of what I was talking about on January 6th. But I think understanding our role and that bigger arc of history and that bigger perspective makes it more manageable for me. And that helps me to continue moving forward.
Oh, God, I love that. It is so important, because it's like, oh, it's all resting on my shoulders. What do I have to do? I have to do it. I have to do it. And I think, I think especially women and especially Black women in a position like yours feel there's so much weight of the responsibility. And I think being gracious with yourself and espousing that as a value, a part of the movement that interfaith movement or social justice movement, civic movements. I think, gosh, that's going to carry us a long way. And and
Yeah.
and and being gracious with ourselves is a mechanism also to be gracious with others. I mean, being in the world is kind of both a constant state of being incredibly inspired and incredibly disappointed. With family, with friends, and with society around. And so being gracious, how can we be gracious with others if we can't be gracious with ourselves and give ourselves a break? I mean, it is true. Like I beat myself up so much And it's like, whoa, who's helping? All of us try to do it. I think it's actually like, it's something that we really need to be cognizant of. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And also the mysticism and the making space for, for hearing that voice. And that is a wonderful Catholic contribution. And, I'm going to misplace it, but this, at the base, all is well. All is well. There. I think it's Hildegard of Bingen. And just like
Yeah.
allowing ourselves to hear that from God, even as we do the hard work, knowing that around us there's so many things that do need to change.
Yeah. And I would say it is, I mean, I think Catholicism has many examples, many saints who practice that. But I love seeing that through line across religions. This concept that I have to do my part, and my part is connected to others' parts throughout history. You see that in Judaism, you see that in Islam, you see that in Buddhism. I think, my experience has been Catholic, but leading an interfaith organization, I easily see mystical practices, that practice of forgiveness, kindness, graciousness. I see it all the time throughout other religions too. So when I see that pattern, it tells me that there's a deeper truth there, and the voice of God is there. And so I think that's an invitation for us to listen carefully.
Oh my goodness. And it's one of those wonderful dividends of interfaith work, where all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, that's so good what you're saying, and I didn't know about that at all. It really is like, it's such one of the reasons that this work is such a blessing is, expanding our sense of spiritual resources, just being aware of them, if not immediately practicing them. So, so I do want to get into this, kind of crazy whiplash feeling of having, the inauguration of Donald Trump and all that is already happening with that.
Yeah.
On the same day as we remember the legacy of Dr. King. And, as we've talked about it with many people on this program, Dr. King also was not alone. He was part of a big an understatement, a huge understatement. So it's almost like, the many, many women and men who were around Dr. King, including his wife, Coretta Scott King, but also just the many women and men activists, women and men religious leaders from all different traditions, by the way, religious traditions. So we can, in some ways, like trying to acknowledge both of those things at the same time is this, weird, how are you handling that? Like that, I think it's a blessing, in fact, that we have that Dr. King, that we're being reminded of Dr. King exactly on the day when Donald Trump is coming in with all his chaos and nonsense. But curious how you're understanding, the broader message of King in light of what we're experiencing today.
I think you said part of it, both with the commemoration of Dr. King's legacy and with the inauguration of Donald Trump. These are moments that are being acknowledged on a particular day, but both of those events and the dynamics around them carry across generations, quite frankly. And so if we understand the legacy of Dr. King, or if we understand the inauguration of Donald Trump as individual instances, we're missing the vast majority of what it means. I think that January 20th this year is an opportunity for so many of us. We are at a turning point in our nation's history, and Dr. King lived during a time where our nation was also at a major turning point that was filled with uncertainty and filled with fear in a lot of ways, fear of change, fear of difference, and quite frankly, fear of violence. And we have been seeing an increase in political violence and division over the last few years, just as Dr. King was experiencing it and the communities that he served. So I think the 20th is an opportunity for us as faith leaders to live into our responsibility to be voices of moral clarity, just as Dr. King was, and to guide our communities towards accountability and seeking reconciliation. I don't think you can have reconciliation without accountability. But too often we separate them, we create a false binary, and it is possible to have both. And I think Dr. King is a beautiful example of how we can work towards both at the same time.
The moral clarity piece, I mean, this is part of the trick right now, because of like all the different things, and because of the way information is being received and being, put out there in ways that are intentionally disorienting and intentionally smudging the line of what is moral and what is immoral. I think that I just want to underscore how important that is, and in knowing, like that there is a right and wrong here. Like, we're not crazy, because there's like crazy making. I really appreciate you lifting that up, and I do appreciate the lifting up voices who have moral clarity right now, and that is faith leaders, artists, all the usual folks who have said the real thing in times when it needed to be said, and so I really appreciate that. Let's talk about faith in public life right now, and just a little bit about this really important organization and how you are imagining your, kind of, I don't want to say response, because it doesn't have to be reactive. Like, how you're imagining putting forward still your vision and what you are hoping for this moment.
Yeah. Well, Faith in Public Life, as you know, is an interfaith organization, and we are a national coalition of faith leaders from different traditions. And we're continuing to build that coalition in this time, especially focused on peacemaking, because one thing that we are seeing is the rise and the spread of political violence. So, violence not only in our elections process, but also violence in our communities that people are using for political gain. The rhetoric that our leaders are using that encourage violence and justify violence against different marginalized communities is being used for political gain. And so our role, as we see it in the next several years, is to be peacemakers. And I want to be really explicit, because oftentimes people think peacemakers means that we ignore justice, that we ignore right from wrong, that we ignore equity. And that's not actually what we mean. Our leaders are being trained and equipped to speak out with tools and resources and messages that reflect what most people of faith in our country believe around wanting communities that are inclusive and whole and healthy. But also being supported and equipped to say that in ways that do have moral courage and moral clarity, that do challenge our thinking a bit. So some things that Think of Public Life is doing, we are continuing to test and listen to people of faith across the country about what messages are resonating most with us, and what messages do we want to hear more of in the public discourse, so that our faith leaders can use the language that we actually believe and that we actually want to hear, instead of getting caught up in a distortion of what people of faith think and believe around important issues. We're training people of faith to be able to do that better, not only in their messaging and changing the narrative, but also in directly engaging against actions and beliefs that harm our neighbors and that harm our communities. And then finally, we're building out frameworks about how our faith traditions teach us how to create communities of belonging. So when you look at lessons about how to reconcile, how to forgive one another, how to repair harm, how to hold each other accountable, how to create new solutions, our faith wisdom, our stories, our scriptures, our prophets, our gurus, they all teach us how to do that over and over again. And we need those lessons now more than ever to create belonging in our country.
Mm, that just sounds so good. So, just for our listeners, faithinpubliclife.org.
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, and I love that, and I think the question of like what it means to create peace now, and especially if we think of that in light of our conversation with Dr. King and so many of the other, you know, they were not like just accepting things in order to keep the peace. In fact, that's what they were being told they should do.
Yes.
And he was like, no, that's not actually keeping the peace. Keeping the peace is actually creating the society where we can all live in peace without fear of violence, and that is different. And one of the most I had the great honor to interview Representative John Lewis when he had a book out about his faith, and he said, we really trained people before they went out on the picket line or before they went out on a march. We trained them in nonviolence because it's a discipline.
Yes.
It's something that takes thought. It's something that takes discipline. And so what you're doing it sounds very much in line with that, that this isn't something. I think it's hard. It's hard. Nonviolence is hard, especially when you see terrible things going down, which we are seeing.
Yes.
And so I just want to applaud that so much. If you don't mind just saying just a couple things that you think are as part of the broader teaching of faith leaders and others, like what's one or two that you just think like, please, if you hear nothing else, hear this. Is there anything that comes to mind?
So I think there were a lot of questions about how to continue to associate or listen to people who maybe voted different from you, or who are espousing beliefs that are nationalist beliefs or racist beliefs or homophobic or xenophobic beliefs. And at this point, how can I look that person in the eye? How can I continue to associate that person? How can I love my neighbor? We just released an op-ed in Religion News Service yesterday discussing why I should still love my neighbor in light of these things. And I think a big part of what we're facing right now as a nation is that question: why should I still love my neighbor as I'm called to do? And for folks who are listening, I think the answer is we must do that because that is who we are. And we have to listen and understand as much as we can where people are coming from and why they hold the beliefs they do, why they're making the choices that they do. But in doing that listening, we also have to speak honestly and compassionately with love. And it's the pairing of the listening and the speaking that is more important than ever right now. Because when we listen, we hear that a lot of people are voting for nationalist ideals or authoritarian ideals because they feel unheard, because they feel unseen, because they are afraid. And that fear is very, very powerful. And when we listen to leaders like Dr. King, and John Lewis and other folks came before us, we see very much that when we engage people's fear with compassion while still speaking the truth about another vision and what needs to happen, it can be very transformative. So I think that requires spiritual discipline. It requires training, as we said. It requires prayer. It requires faith. But it is, in fact, possible and it is transformative. And sadly, because of what we've seen with the violence against leaders like Dr. King and the multiple assassination attempts against him, that sadly is an indicator of how transformative and how powerful his approach was and still is today. So when we talk about real change and we talk about deep change, I think we have to pay attention to the impact that listening while speaking the truth from a place of compassion can really have.
Mm. Okay, you're preaching to me right now because honestly, like I've had a really hard time.
Yeah.
I have to say, like with seeing my neighbor right now and loving my neighbor, and recognizing the humanity in people who I feel are, um, coming coming for me. It's very like, my hand clenches as a fist as opposed to extend as in a handshake. And so I think it's so important you're saying that. And I also think it's important that our listeners are hearing also that this takes a partner who is not only wanting to talk, but also willing to listen to you.
Yep.
And this is about creating a broader environment where those kind of interactions can happen and all of that. But actually, what I hear you saying is that, faith in public life is really going to be helping people be out there speaking to one another in truth, but also in love, as is mandated by our tradition. So I love that. Thank you so much for that work. And thank you for like the bravery of that work or courage or however, I mean, it's really courageous work. It takes a lot of discipline, but it's so spiritually grounded and so real for this time. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I want to elaborate on that a little bit. So, two things. My grandmother, her name was Hilda Donald, big influence in my life, the one that founded a church. My grandmother used to say all the time that her responsibility was to be obedient to what God was asking her to do. So, her ministry was very much oriented in service. She served a lot of people with mental disabilities, people encountering homelessness. And she often got a lot of questions, a lot of doubt about what she could do. And her response all the time was, my responsibility is to do what God has asked me to do, and not to stunt myself because of what I think the consequences might be. And that practice is, for me, dependent on having a close relationship with God, whether that is that mystical meditative relationship, a deep prayer life, studying scriptures or wisdom traditions, being in a faith community, because that's what grounds us to discern what it means to be obedient in this given moment. And so the way others treat us does not dictate how we treat other people. And I think, again, my grandmother, Dr. King, many other people have taught us that. So going forward in this, as I'm discerning, the listening is a part of discerning. I believe that God is asking us, people who believe in God, people of faith, to be compassionate and to listen to others who position themselves as our enemies. But God is also asking us very, very clearly to stand up and speak truth, and to resist violence, and to denounce violence. And both of those things can happen at the same time, but we can't listen carefully if we don't first get grounded and centered in what it means to be obedient to God. So I think we see this example over and over throughout our faith traditions. I really appreciate the concept of koanic thinking in Buddhism, that opens our minds to seeing a situation from a different perspective, a different point of view. All of those practices are are so needed for us right now in this moment. And those are the practices that are going to help us stay rooted in our true identities as children of God, and not get swept up in the negativity and the violence that's being thrust upon us, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's so important, and part of what I'm hearing there is like, don't let others define you in this moment.
Exactly.
Be you, be you, and what you know to be true, and how you're supposed to be. Even if there's all sorts of others examples of how, and there's I think a very legitimate. Okay, if we're going to play that way, we're going to play that way. That can also help. We can lose ourselves. Last question I want to ask you is like, what can you imagine in 4 years? If faith in public life and all of the collaborations that you have, including with Interfaith Alliance and so many other, so many others across the country, if we do the thing with all the grace, with all the not beating ourselves up, with all the, if we do the thing, as best we can, what would you love to see?
I see this time as an opportunity. I think we are going to face some very, very trying times. And many of us, many of our brothers and sisters and our neighbors are already being targeted. I think this time is going to, sadly, bring a lot of hurt and a lot of harm for a lot of people. And in that reality, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to see our differences uh, differently. So we have an opportunity to look at folks who might be of a different faith tradition or different race or gender or sexual orientation or nationality. Instead of looking at those differences, to start looking to say, like, who shares our values? Who are the people who want a safe community? Who are the people who want opportunities for everyone to thrive? And to get over ourselves, quite frankly, so that we can come together around what binds us instead of what divides us. So that's an opportunity that I see. And in that opportunity, I hope that we can reimagine what healthy communities look like. And we can start to bring some of that about so that we are modeling for one another the promise of our country, which has not yet been fulfilled. This moment is an opportunity for us to do that because most of us want it. Most of us want to live in a pluralistic society. Most of us want to live in a multiracial, multi-faith democracy where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, especially people of faith. That's what most of us want. And this is our opportunity to put that into practice, regardless of the false stories and the false narratives that are happening around us. So I'm looking forward to us stepping into our leadership more and to the opportunity to make that real.
Jeanné Lewis is CEO at Faith in Public Life, advancing the moral imperative for a just, inclusive, and equitable country so everyone is able to live into their full humanity. Jeanné, on this important week, thank you so much for being with us on The State of Belief.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. It's always a pleasure to see you.
My guess is that you know someone who would get a lot out of this conversation. So please share The State of Belief with them and be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. And if you'd like to make a financial contribution, go to stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.